Welcome to Civics and Coffee. My name is Alicia, and I am a self-professed history nerd. Each week, I'm going to chat about a topic on U.S. history and give you both the highlights and occasionally break down some of the complexities in history and share stories you may not remember learning in high school, all in the time it takes to enjoy a cup of coffee. Hey everyone, welcome back. Today is the anniversary of 16th President Abraham Lincoln's birth. In the United States, February 12th is a national holiday, and so I thought it would be a good time to release a bonus episode. A few weeks ago, I sat down with Dr. Andrew Sillen to chat about his latest book, Kidnapped at Sea, The Civil War Voyage of David Henry White. Dr. Sillen was formerly a professor of paleoanthropology and the founding director of development at the University of Cape Town. We conducted our interview over Zoom, so I'm inserting my standard sound quality warning here. I hope you all enjoy the interview. Hey everyone, with me today is Dr. Andrew Sillen. He is a visiting research scholar in the Department of Anthropology at Rutgers University. He is a prolific author with several writing credits to his name, including his recent book, Kidnapped at Sea, which will be the focus of our conversation today. Welcome, Dr. Sillen.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. And let's just dive right on in. Who was David Henry White?
David Henry White was a free teenage black sailor who got a gig as an assistant cook on a packet ship. That's a ship that carried both cargo and passengers, traveling from Philadelphia to Liverpool in 1862 during the height of the Civil War. And the boat he was on, which was called the Tonawanda, was captured 9 days into its voyage on October 9th, 1862. White was taken from the Tonawanda and enslaved on the Alabama, which was a Confederate commerce raider that was traveling all over the world, attacking Union commerce as part of the South's strategy to counter the North's blockade of the South during the Civil War. White remained on board the Alabama for over 600 days and ultimately tragically drowned in a final climactic battle between the Alabama and U.S. naval vessel, the Kearsarge, which caught up with it 7 miles off Cherbourg. And that battle took place on June 19th, 1864.
And what prompted you to tell White's story?
Well, I didn't know anything about White. I didn't know anything at all about the Alabama's voyage either. When I was working as a young archaeologist at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, I had grown up in America. I had studied history, but I knew very little about the Civil War outside of America. Of course, we're all familiar with the horrific battles that happened on land, but not many of us, and certainly I didn't know that a lot of the Civil War took place on the international stage. It wasn't as deadly, but it was quite important in terms of the outcome of the war. The Civil War had become a kind of war of attrition, and a lot depended upon whether or not France and England recognized the Confederacy. And so there was a tremendous amount of diplomatic activity and commerce warfare that was going on outside of the country. I didn't know any about any of that, but I encountered it rather surprisingly in Cape Town when I stepped into a cultural history museum in about 1986, and I saw a giant Confederate battle ensign. And I asked myself, what's that doing here? And I felt as like one of the few Americans in South Africa at the time, I felt it was almost a responsibility to learn what this was all about. And so I started researching the Alabama and the Kearsarge, the vessel that ultimately vanquished it in the battle off Cherbourg. And at first, I was mainly interested in a kind of meditation on the leadership qualities of the two captains involved. That David White wasn't in the story at all. It was only almost years later, as I really delved into the memoirs of the Alabama's officers, that I encountered David White, and I realized that what the Confederate officers had written about him did not sound right. It sounded off to me because they portrayed White as a willing captor, one who willing captive, an individual who willingly traded his free position on the Tonawanda for his enslaved position on the Alabama, and that just felt so incongruous with contemporary historiography that I felt that I had to dig more into it. And so that began a much larger research project into David Henry White, which became the main story of the book.
Yeah. And so speaking of White, how and why did White become a sailor?
White came from an unusual population in America. He came from a population of free black individuals from Delaware. Now, Delaware and Maryland were interesting because they were border states, and therefore they didn't fit conveniently into the North or the South. And in fact, uh, neither seceded. So, since Delaware was a slave state that remained with the Union, so it was unusual that way. But it was also unusual because, unlike the Deep South, Delaware did not benefit from the huge boom in the cotton industry in the first part of the 19th century. And as a result, Delaware farmers were uh, white Delaware farmers, plantation farmers in the southern county of Sussex, were under significant financial pressure. And therefore, one of the responses was to emancipate slaves that they could no longer support. And as a result, Delaware had a relatively large free black population. Uh, Over 80% of the free of blacks in Delaware were free, as opposed to the Deep South, where it was more like 5 or 6%. But that population was not necessarily free in the sense that we think of individuals having full civil rights uh, today. In fact, the Delaware's free blacks were subject to a number of codes which severely limited their movement and also their education. So most of the population in Sussex County was illiterate, and many of them were trapped in cycles of poverty uh, uh, by rules and regulations which restricted their movement. And White came from that population. Now, one of the reasons he got a job as a sailor is that one of the few ways to evade Delaware's codes was that there was a loophole in Delaware law. Delaware law made it illegal for free blacks to enter the state for more than 60 days. And it made it illegal for free blacks within the states to leave the state and come back. So if you left the state, they didn't want folks that had been corrupted by the experience of freedom in the North to come back to Delaware and infect, would be a way they might have thought of it, the local enslaved with ideas of freedom. And so they restricted the ability to come back. But Delaware made an exception for those who went to sea. And the law that under which White went to sea allowed free blacks to leave the state if they were in the employ of, if they were a waterman or pursuing their occupation as a sailor. And so, taking advantage of that, White was able to leave Lewis and get a gig. He was about 16 or 17 years old, and he got a gig as an assistant cook on on the ship, which was owned by the Copes Line out of Philadelphia.
And you talked a little bit about it in your opener about kind of who David White was, but how did he find himself on the Alabama?
White was on his second voyage. His first voyage with the Cope company was on a ship called the Wyoming, and he took this voyage from Philadelphia to Liverpool, remained in Liverpool for about 3 weeks on a layover, and returned on the Wyoming. It was a fairly long go back, uh, and perhaps stopping in Boston. Uh, and then he returned to Philadelphia, but in one of the most significant weeks in American history. He returned to Philadelphia during the time that Lincoln released the draft Emancipation Proclamation after the horrific Battle of Antietam. And the news of both the Antietam battle and also the draft Emancipation Proclamation would have been in the mailbags of the next ship that White took with the Cope Line, and that was the next scheduled voyage from Philadelphia to Liverpool on the Tonawanda. So the Tonawanda's mailbags would have included the draft Emancipation Proclamation. White's gig on this vessel showed that he had, considerable sophistication about his choice of positions and the folks he worked with. It turns out that the two sailors that were his companions, that is the three-man team of cooks on the Tonawanda, but the two men that he sailed with were members of a network of free black abolitionist sailors that transmitted abolitionist materials and publications between white and black abolitionists in the UK and the US. And I document that network. So, he wasn't, on his own here. He had traveled on a safe ship, a ship with politically active abolitionist companions, a ship that was owned by Quaker abolitionists, and a ship that was relatively safe, had been at sea for over 20 years and was well managed. 9 days into the voyage, it encounters the Alabama, which was by then a few weeks into its cruise. And the Alabama was charged with destroying Union commerce, at which it was phenomenally successful. And even before it had encountered the Tonawanda, it had already destroyed a whale whaling fleet off the Azores. So, a few weeks into the voyage, the Alabama encounters the Tonawanda, and for reasons that are not clear, Semmes has the crew mustered and selects White to be taken onto the Alabama, where he is enslaved. And Semmes describes him as a slave and describes the circumstances of his capture. And what I do in the book is a forensic analysis of what Semmes has to say about White. And what I'm able to show is that virtually everything Semmes says about White's status, about his capture, about the circumstances of his capture, all of those things are shown to be lies. And that, in many ways, is the point of the book. There is not a whole lot of information about White, but what there is a documentation that what was said about White was lies. Yeah. And it is the distortion and the appropriation of White's life, which is really the most important outcome of the book, I believe.
Yeah. And that's a great segue to my next question is, as much as this book is trying to kind of fill the gaps and tell the story of David Henry White, it's also about the man responsible for his capture, Raphael Semmes. So who was he?
Raphael Semmes was an extraordinary figure in the 19th century. He came from a very empowered slaveholding family going back 5 generations in America. His ancestor had come over with Lord Calvert on the Ark in 1620, I believe. Not sure about the exact date, but definitely early 17th century. So a real founding dynastic family in Maryland. His uncles were very well-known businessmen in Washington, D.C. One uncle owned an establishment which became McCandless Tavern, which was a slave trading establishment that was described in 12 Years a Slave. Uh, and Semmes has been generally known as a formidable belligerent, naval belligerent in the Civil War. So by the time the Civil War broke out, Semmes was one of the first to resign from the Union Navy, from the American Navy. He immediately transferred his allegiance to the South. He was a strong advocate of secession and slavery. And as I say, as a successful naval belligerent, he was unparalleled. Together with the other commerce raiders, they destroyed much of Union commerce. The Alabama alone, over 60 Union vessels destroyed on the high seas. And it was argued that the American merchant marine never really recovered from the disaster. There was such a vibrant trade, mercantile trade, before the Civil War that American fleets never really quite came back to that kind of dominance globally. Anyway, while Semmes is so well known as a naval belligerent, he's less well known as one of the intellectual proponents of secession and the Civil War. And in 1869, he published a very important memoir about the war, in which he opens with a 70-page dense reinvention of the war's purpose. Mm. And in this book, as well as other manuscripts at the time, there was very conscious creation of a revisionist history of the Civil War, which became known as generally as the Lost Cause. The Lost Cause, you may have heard of as a phrase. It's been described as a narrative, as a mythology, as a civil religion. It's a collection of narratives which reinvented the Civil War, firstly as more of a sort of economic and constitutional disagreement rather than a frank secession to protect slavery. Mm-hmm. So kind of a moral reinvention of the war. And secondly, a series of narratives that creates a number of tropes, some of which we're all very familiar with in popular culture and have survived. One of those tropes being that of the contented servant with an affectionate relationship with the slaveholding family. So Semmes describes in both the previous memoir and this affectionate relationship. Your listeners will be familiar, of course, with Gone with the Wind and the way in which Hollywood portrayed Black people, throughout most of the early 20th century and mid 20th century. And this is a trope which goes back to well before the war. Now, what's interesting about Semmes's book is that he describes White in this way as a happy servant, contented in servility, affectionate relationship between master and servant. And not only do I show that everything he says about White is a lie, but the point of that is that in this book, Semmes invents the caricature. So it's not just that he's using an existing relationship to illustrate a point. He's actually inventing a relationship and conveying his racist worldview to his audience through the medium of an invented David White. So White's life has been appropriated to serve a function. And the point of the research is that White's actual life belies that function and belies the lost cause that Semmes and others had constructed. And there is a resonance that we can find between the construction of the lost cause and the construction of some of the narratives and civic religions we live with today, most notably Stop the Steal narrative regarding the 2020 election. Right. Also, a constructed story which does not survive interrogation when the facts are looked at forensically.
Yeah. And that's a great kind of segue to the next question that I have for you, which is, what does this story tell us about the Civil War and the Black experience specifically during the conflict?
Well, it's very much a book about invisibility. Uh, I've had some feedback from folks who say, well, they wish there was more in the book about White himself.
Yeah.
And I try and prepare the reader by saying, this isn't a biography. You can't write a biography of a ghost.
Yeah.
The whole point of the book is White's invisibility. And just as Semmes makes an example of White by describing White as if he were representative of a larger population, we can say, what's interesting about White, as much as his actual life, what's interesting about him is how his life was appropriated and how his life was also, his actual life is almost completely invisible. And that is the fate of the illiterate and the fate of the disempowered. And the book is a point about that. So how do you deal with that? I mean, I know the next question already, which is, well, how do you write about, somebody for whom there's so little information?
Yeah.
And there, I tried to do it this way. I recognized that one problem is that we cannot simply substitute one appropriation of White's life with another.
Yeah.
And therefore, it was important to stick to the facts. And so the approach was, in the first instance, forensic. What do we actually know? That's what I started with. Then going beyond that, I was able to imagine White. If you think of the mind as kind of a vessel, there was no way to know what White thought. However, I could describe what White experienced. And so I was able to describe not what's in the vessel, but the walls of the vessel, or perhaps another way to put it is the form or the mold from which the vessel was made. So I describe everybody White knew. I describe the experiences that we know that he had. And I let the reader imagine themselves in White's circumstance. And that, I believe, is the closest that we can get to knowing him without appropriating or fictionalizing anything about him.
And can you share a little bit about how your training in anthropology kind of helped in crafting the story of David Henry White?
Well, in some ways it hindered, in some ways it helped. It hindered in the sense that, I'm enough of an academic to know that if anybody were from outside of my discipline were writing about what I know about, which is, the Pleistocene of South Africa, I would be, quite suspicious and expect them to have become completely familiar with the canon and wondering how they could possibly do it. And so, I was very aware that historians and others would be similarly cautious in anything that I wrote. And I was very fortunate with Johns Hopkins University Press to have phenomenal reviewers. And the result of it was that I was able to engage with the relevant historiography, but it was a very steep learning curve. Having done that, the advantage of coming from outside the discipline is that I looked at things in ways that conventionally trained historians may not. And that enabled me to add some dimensions to the story that otherwise weren't there. And part of it was just the fearlessness of looking into somebody's life for whom there are no written records.
Yeah.
And really, I think that is the mindset of the archaeologist. Archaeology is all about recovering lives, stories, trends, events, histories of those who left no written record of their existence. And so we have to be imaginative about how we go about uh, investigating those lives. And I thought I brought that perspective to it. The fearlessness of just going wherever I had to go to find out whatever I could about White. The other way I was influenced by anthropology is that when I was in graduate school, I was very fortunate at the University of Pennsylvania in the 1970s to take a course with Anthony Wallace, who was one of the major figures in the field of personality and culture. Wallace had written about a series of events that had taken place in upstate New York in the early 19th century that resulted in the development of a new religion called the Handsome Lake religion. And he spun this story into a theory of culture change and rapid culture change, particularly with regard to what became known as and what he identified as revitalization movements. And I was very impressed with how Wallace had told a story and then had managed to extract so much juice from that story and spit it into a much larger and impactful narrative, which was quite informative about culture change generally. And I liked the idea that he could tell a story and also make the story tell. And so I tried to do that in my book. I was very much influenced by that approach.
Yeah. Oh, it came through. And I think the thing that was most impressive for me, having the historical training and knowing how difficult it is to craft a story about someone who is largely missing from the record, is the fact that you were able to pull all of these, a wide breadth of source material to help us understand the moment in which White lived. And I thought I felt like it was done in a way that only somebody who's got training in like anthropology, archaeology could do, because that's just your bread and butter. That's how you do it. And I thought it was really well done in how it turned into the narrative. I thought, like I said, before we started recording, it was a page turner for me.
Well, thank you for that. So, your readers might be interested that there's a structure to the book. My difficulty was that on the one hand, I wanted this book to have the legitimacy and the rigor of academic research, but I also wanted it to have the reach and the impact, the accessibility of a trade book. And it was difficult to figure out a way to do both without alienating some part of the readership. And so what I settled on is a triptych. And as you could tell from the index, the book is divided into three parts: context, voyage, and aftermath. And the reason I did that was so that I could deal with all of the historical context and historiography that had to be addressed to some extent separately. So the historiography is done first, and the interpretation and the analysis is done last. But the central panel of the triptych is the narrative, straightforward narrative of the voyage. Yeah. And that is the way I dealt with all the different audiences that I was trying to reach with this volume.
Well, quite deftly, if in my personal opinion, I thought, like I said, it was, you would sit down and I look up and it's an hour and a half later and I have to go about my day. So it was very well crafted.
I'm very pleased to hear that.
And so, what do you hope readers take away from your book?
I think the most important lesson is that history, as we all know it, is written by the literate. Mm-hmm. And therefore, our memory of major events in our past is skewed. So this is particularly the case with the Civil War. Civil War is a very easy series of events to illustrate this. because it was so profound and so much so burned into the American consciousness. But it's not just the Civil War. I think it's virtually all of history since there was writing.
Yeah.
So all the history that archaeologists don't deal with is the history of the literate. And the history of the literate is not the history of humanity.
Yeah.
So what we need to be aware of are not just what we have been told, but also the gaps. And when we look for the gaps and we change the questions we ask, and we start asking questions like, well, what was life like for the enslaved?
Yeah.
And what do we know as opposed to what we are told by the slavers? We get a different story. And I think it's quite important if we are interested in the truth and if we're interested in human behavior and if we're interested in learning from the past and if we're interested in the past informing the present, as we're all told we should, then we get the story right. And to get the story right means that we have to go beyond what we are told and what's written and look at what was left out.
Yeah. Well put. Where should readers go when they finish your book and they want to learn more about all of the things that you've covered, White and Semmes and the Alabama?
Well, there's not that much more about White. I think I've squeezed every last ounce of juice from that. But there is another article that I published with a little bit more detail in the Journal of the Pennsylvania Historical Society, the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography, which came out also this year. And there's more detail there about the Cope family archive and how I found White in that archive. So that's one place. If your readers are interested more in the Civil War at sea generally, and the Civil War internationally, I really recommend Amanda Foreman's book, A World on Fire. That's a fabulous account of all of the machinations that were going on in the UK during the Civil War. And if you want to learn more about my work, which is not about the Civil War, but about the Pleistocene in South Africa, then I guide your readers to my website, kidnapped@sea.com, and that will have not only selected publications from my academic research, but you'll also find there appearances and webcasts and podcasts like this one as they're published. We'll add links on the website.
Wonderful. And knowing you just wrapped up this book and all of the work that you put into it, is there anything else that you're working on that you can share with listeners?
Yeah, I've got a project going. It's one that I've inherited, and I still need to develop. My mother, whose name was Estelle Fuchs, was an anthropologist who studied the anthropology of education. And she was fascinated with the problems that people living today have navigating the modern world with traditional values, particularly in the field of education. And in the 1970s, she had co-authored National Study of American Indian Education. And she left me a manuscript on a series of events that occurred on the Navajo Reservation in 1909, when the U.S. cavalry was sent in to arrest traditional leaders who would not send their children to Bureau of Indian Affairs schools, boarding schools, where they were not allowed to learn Navajo. And so that's quite an extraordinary and important story, and it's going to require some work to panel beat it into shape where it can be published, and that's my next big deal. I've also got my own archaeological work, and I hope to have a major article coming out on the Pleistocene of South Africa in the next few months. Look out for that.
All right. Wonderful. Well, is there anything that we haven't covered yet that you want future readers to know?
No, I'm good.
Okay.
Uh,
Wonderful. Then, for all the listeners out there, be sure to pick up a copy of Kidnapped at Sea to learn the important story of David Henry White. Dr. Sillen grounds you in the textures of the past and brings White to life in a creative and academically rigorous manner. If you are interested in the Civil War, Black or naval history, this is the book for you. Thank you again, Dr. Sillen.
Thank you so much.
Thanks again to Dr. Sillen for coming on and chatting about his book, Kidnapped at Sea. Thanks, peeps. I'll see you Saturday. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of Civics and Coffee. If you want to hear more small snippets from American history, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to our next cup of coffee together.